The police in Red Creek believed they owned the town. They intimidated shop owners, silenced the fearful, and treated kindness as weakness. But one quiet morning, they made a mistake. In a small roadside diner, they targeted a stranger and his calm, obedient canine, assuming he was just another man who would look away. What they didn't know was that this stranger was a former U.S. Marine who had already survived far worse than bullies with badges. And without raising his voice or firing a weapon, he was about to expose everything. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, please subscribe for more. Dawn settled gently over Red Creek, Montana, carrying a cool, late spring breeze that drifted through quiet streets and sunlit storefronts. It was the kind of morning that felt steady and familiar, as if nothing bad could happen here. And that promise of calm lay softly over the town. Ethan Walker remained in his pickup for a moment after parking, his hands resting on the worn steering wheel. He was 43, tall and broad, with the solid build of a man who had spent most of his life following orders and carrying weight, both physical and invisible. His dark hair had grown longer since leaving the Marines, threaded now with gray at the temples, and a neatly kept beard framed a face defined by hard angles and restraint. A faint scar near his left eyebrow marked an old mistake, one that had followed him home from service and quietly shaped the way he watched the world. He had not come to Red Creek to hide. He had come to learn how to live without bracing for impact. Beside him, Axel shifted slightly. The German Shepherd was nearly 6 years old, large and powerfully built, his black and tan coat glossy and well-kept. His amber eyes were alert but calm, holding the patient intelligence of a working dog who understood silence better than noise. A small nick in his right ear hinted at years of disciplined service. Axel did not whine or pull at the leash. He simply waited, trusting Ethan completely, as he always had. They crossed the street together and entered the diner, a modest place with wide windows, chrome trim, and vinyl booths worn smooth by decades of regulars. The smell of coffee, buttered toast, and bacon wrapped around them like a memory from another life. A few heads turned, older couples, a farmer in a seed company cap, 2 women sharing a folded newspaper. Their expressions were polite, curious, but guarded. Ethan felt it immediately. Not unkindness, just distance. The way small towns protect themselves by watching first and welcoming later. A woman approached with a practiced smile and a notepad tucked beneath her arm. Her name tag read Linda. Linda Harris was 35, slim but sturdy, with chestnut brown hair pulled into a low ponytail. A few loose strands framed her face, which carried the soft lines of someone who smiled often but worried more than she let on. Her skin was lightly freckled, her eyes a steady hazel that missed very little. She moved with efficiency, but there was tension in her shoulders, the posture of someone used to balancing kindness against responsibility. "Morning," she said warmly, though her gaze flicked briefly to Axel before returning to Ethan. "You can sit wherever you like." "Thank you," Ethan replied, his voice low and calm. He chose a corner booth, instinctively placing his back to the wall. Axel settled beneath the table without command, folding his long body neatly, chin resting on his paws. He looked almost asleep, though Ethan knew better. Axel was always listening. As Linda walked away, Ethan noticed how conversation dipped for a moment, how the room subtly recalibrated around them. No one stared outright, but no one fully relaxed either. He ordered eggs, toast, and coffee, simple, dependable, and waited. Linda returned first with water, setting an extra bowl down for Axel. "For him," she said softly. "It's supposed to warm up later." "That's kind of you," Ethan said. Their eyes met briefly. In that glance he saw not fear, but calculation. The quiet arithmetic of a woman with bills to pay, a child to raise, and no margin for trouble. "He's well trained," she added. more to reassure herself than him. "Yes, ma'am," Ethan said with a faint smile. "He's good company." She nodded and moved back toward the counter. Ethan watched her shoulders straighten only once she was safely behind it. That was when he felt it again, that subtle tension beneath the diner's friendly surface. This place was clean, orderly, and warm, but something here was held too tightly, like a breath waiting to be released. His food arrived, and he ate slowly, savoring the normalcy. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine mornings like this becoming routine. Land to tend, quiet nights, a life measured in seasons instead of missions. Axel remained still beneath the table, a steady presence anchoring him. Then the bell above the door rang sharply. 2 police officers stepped inside, and the atmosphere shifted at once. One of them stood out immediately. Officer Caleb Norton was in his late 30s, thick-necked and broad through the chest, with closely cropped blonde hair and a permanent smirk that suggested confidence born from familiarity rather than respect. His uniform fit a little too snug around the middle, and his eyes scanned the room with bored authority, as if everything inside already belonged to him. He paused when he noticed Axel. His gaze lingered, just a second too long. Ethan felt it like a pressure change in his chest, an old instinct stirring. Caleb leaned toward his partner and muttered something under his breath, not meant for the room, but not quiet enough either. His eyes never left the dog. "Dogs like that," Caleb said casually, "usually bring trouble with them." Axel did not move. Ethan did not look up. But the promise of a peaceful morning cracked, just slightly, and something unsettled slipped quietly into Red Creek. The bell above the diner door had barely stopped ringing when the air inside shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like a room cooling after a window had been opened in winter. Conversations thinned, forks paused halfway to mouths, and even the hum of the coffee machine seemed to soften. Ethan felt it before he saw them, the same way he used to sense movement before sound in places far less forgiving than Red Creek. The 2 police officers moved with unhurried confidence, as if time itself bent slightly to accommodate them. The one Ethan had already noticed lingered in the doorway for a second longer than necessary. Officer Caleb Norton carried himself like a man accustomed to rooms rearranging around him. He was broad through the shoulders, his blonde hair cropped close, his clean-shaven face marked by a permanent half-smile that never reached his eyes. His movements were casual, but not relaxed. There was an edge to him, sharpened by years of being obeyed without question. Something about him suggested he had never been meaningfully challenged, and that absence had shaped him more than any training ever could. Behind him walked Officer Ryan Cole, younger by several years and visibly narrower in build. Ryan had dark hair cut short on the sides and longer on top, the kind of style that tried too hard to look effortless. His face was angular, his jaw tight, and faint shadows under his eyes hinted at poor sleep or restless nights. He laughed easily when Caleb spoke, a quick, reflexive sound that felt practiced. Ryan followed more than he led, his posture subtly angled toward Caleb as if waiting for cues on how to behave. Neither officer greeted anyone. They did not nod to familiar faces or exchange pleasantries. They simply walked in and claimed space. Ethan did not look up from his plate, but his awareness sharpened. Axel remained under the table, still and silent, though one ear tilted slightly toward the sound of heavy boots on tile. Ethan reached down and rested his fingers lightly against the dog's collar, not a command, just a reassurance. Linda noticed them immediately. Her shoulders tensed, and the smile she had worn moments earlier softened into something more careful. She wiped her hands on her apron and straightened, her posture professional but alert. Ethan caught the brief glance she sent toward the counter, toward the cash register, toward nothing in particular. It was the look of someone mentally checking a list she had memorized too well. Caleb's gaze drifted through the diner until it settled, inevitably, on Ethan's booth. His eyes dropped to the floor, catching the edge of Axel's black and tanned fur beneath the table. A flicker of interest crossed his face, quickly masked by amusement. He reached for a large paper cup of coffee resting on the counter. Linda had just poured it, steam still curling from the lid. "Careful," Ryan said lightly, though there was no urgency in his voice. Caleb waved him off and continued toward the center of the room, his boots heavy, deliberate. As he passed Ethan's table, his foot clipped the leg just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to feel intentional. The movement caused his hand to tilt, and the lid of the coffee cup shifted. The coffee spilled, dark and steaming, splashing across the floor mere inches from Axel's front paws. The sound was soft, but sharp enough to cut through the room. Axel flinched, his muscles tightening for a fraction of a second. His head lifted, amber eyes open now, alert and focused. He did not growl. He did not bark. He did not move beyond that single, restrained reaction. Years of training held him steady, even as instinct screamed otherwise. Ethan's hand moved calmly. He slid the water bowl back with his foot, ensuring none of the hot liquid could reach it. He did not look at Caleb. He did not speak. For a moment, no one did. Caleb stopped and looked down at the spill, then at Axel, then finally at Ethan. His expression carried mock surprise, his eyebrows lifting slightly. "Didn't see that," he said, his tone casual, almost friendly. "Big dog. Takes up space." Ryan chuckled, glancing around the room as if waiting for someone else to join in. No one did. Ethan slowly lifted his gaze. His eyes were steady, unreadable. "He's under the table," he said evenly. "Out of the way." The simplicity of the statement seemed to irritate Caleb more than anger would have. He tilted his head, studying Ethan now, as if reassessing him. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought the officer might push further. Instead, Caleb shrugged and stepped back, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Just saying," Caleb replied. "Accidents happen." He moved on, leaving the coffee to pool and cool on the tile. Linda appeared almost immediately with a stack of napkins, kneeling to clean the mess before anyone asked. Her movements were quick, efficient, her face composed. But her hands trembled slightly as she worked. Ethan noticed. So did Axel. Around them, the diner slowly resumed its rhythm, though it felt forced now, like a song restarted after an interruption. People avoided looking at Ethan's table. A woman near the window stirred her coffee repeatedly without taking a sip. The farmer in the seed company cap stared too intently at his plate. Ethan sat back, appetite gone. He watched not the officers, but the people around them. He noticed how voices stayed low, how laughter didn't quite return, how no one commented on the spill, or the dog, or the officer's behavior. It wasn't politeness. It wasn't minding one's business. It was fear. Linda finished cleaning and stood, smoothing her apron. She glanced at Ethan, her eyes apologetic, then turned away quickly, as if even that look carried risk. Caleb and Ryan took a booth near the front, spreading out as though claiming territory. Caleb leaned back, one arm draped over the seat, his voice loud again, filling the space. Ryan nodded along, laughing too easily. Ethan reached down and scratched Axel gently behind the ears. "Good," he murmured, too softly for anyone else to hear. Axel settled again, his breathing slow, his body still, but his eyes remained open. Ethan stared into his cooling coffee and felt the last of his illusions slip quietly away. This town wasn't unfriendly. It wasn't rude. It was careful. And care like this came from knowing exactly what could happen if it failed. The silence, he realized, wasn't courtesy. It was survival. The officers finished their coffee without paying, leaving the booth with the same unhurried confidence they had brought in. The bell rang again as the door closed behind them, and only then did the diner seem to breathe out. The sound of forks returned, cautious at first, then steadier, as if everyone were trying to convince themselves that nothing unusual had happened. Ethan remained seated, his hands wrapped loosely around his mug, watching the way tension lingered like dust in sunlight. Linda Harris moved behind the counter with practiced efficiency, wiping down surfaces that were already clean. Up close, the strain on her face was clearer. At 35, she carried herself like someone older, not in years, but in responsibility. Her chestnut hair, pulled tight at the nape of her neck, revealed faint shadows beneath her eyes, evidence of short nights and early mornings. Her skin was fair, lightly freckled from years of Montana sun, and her expression held a careful balance between warmth and caution. She was the kind of woman who smiled because it made things easier, not because she felt light-hearted. Ethan waited until the rush eased before approaching the counter. He did not want to draw attention, only clarity. "Excuse me," he said quietly. Linda turned, her smile returning on instinct, though it softened when she recognized him. "Everything okay?" she asked. "The coffee incident earlier. Not about that," Ethan replied gently. "Just wanted to say thank you for the water." Her eyes flicked briefly toward the door, then back to him. "Of course," she said. "We try to take care of everyone." There was something in her tone that suggested the effort came at a cost. A small boy appeared from the back hallway then, no older than 8. He had sandy blonde hair that fell into his eyes and wore a hoodie a size too big, the sleeves pushed up around his wrists. His sneakers were scuffed, and he moved quietly, as if accustomed to staying out of the way. "Mom," he whispered, tugging lightly at Linda's apron. Linda's posture changed instantly. The tightness in her shoulders softened, her expression warming in a way that felt unguarded. "Sweetheart," she murmured, crouching slightly to meet his eyes. "I told you to stay in the back until I'm done here." The boy nodded, glancing shyly at Ethan and Axel. Axel lifted his head just enough to acknowledge him, tail thumping once against the floor. The boy's eyes widened, curiosity overtaking caution. "He's beautiful," he said. Linda smiled despite herself. "Go on now," she said, guiding him gently away. "I'll be there soon." Ethan watched them disappear into the hallway. The pieces fell into place quietly, without drama. Single mother. Child on site because childcare was expensive or unreliable. A job that wasn't just a paycheck, but a lifeline. He paid his bill and left a little extra on the counter, not as charity, but as thanks. Linda noticed and shook her head slightly, though she didn't push it back. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know," Ethan replied, "but I wanted to." As he turned to leave, a voice stopped him. "You're not from around here." The man who spoke was seated alone near the window. He looked to be in his late 60s, thin and stooped, with a weathered face and hands marked by decades of physical work. His hair was white and sparse beneath a faded baseball cap, and his eyes, pale blue and sharp, held a knowing calm. His name, Ethan would later learn, was Harold Pike. Harold had spent most of his life in Red Creek, first as a mechanic, then as a widower who came to the diner every morning because routine was easier than empty kitchens. "No," Ethan said simply. "Just moved in." Harold nodded, stirring his coffee slowly. "Figured," he said. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Word of advice." Ethan waited. "In Red Creek," Harold continued, "it's best not to stand out." His gaze flicked briefly toward the counter, then the door. "Not unless you're ready for attention you didn't ask for." Ethan absorbed the words without reaction. "Doesn't seem like anyone here wants trouble," he said. Harold gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "Trouble doesn't ask what you want," he replied. "It notices who's quiet." Outside, the morning had warmed. Ethan paused on the sidewalk, Axel at his side, watching Linda through the diner window. She laughed at something a customer said, but the sound didn't reach her eyes. He imagined the weight she carried home every night, the calculations she made before speaking, before objecting, before standing up. It wasn't fear that kept her silent. It was love. Ethan walked to his truck and opened the door. He had planned to drive back to the farmhouse, maybe start unpacking, maybe head into the next town before sunset. Red Creek had been a stop, nothing more. He sat behind the wheel, engine idling, and stared at the road ahead. Then he shut the engine off. Axel looked at him, ears lifting slightly. Ethan rested a hand on the steering wheel, then on Axel's head. "Not yet," he murmured. He glanced back at the diner one last time, at the place where silence was currency and kindness came with risk. He had intended to leave Red Creek that afternoon. Instead, he stayed. Morning came softly to the farmhouse, a pale ribbon of light slipping through the kitchen window and resting on the scarred wooden table Ethan had yet to refinish. He stood there with his coffee untouched, listening to the quiet. No engines, no radios, no boots on tile. Just wind moving through tall grass and the steady breathing of Axel at his feet. This was the peace he had come for, and yet it felt incomplete now, like a promise interrupted. Ethan drove into town later that morning with no destination in mind. He parked near the square and walked, letting Axel set the pace. The dog moved with easy confidence, 6 years old and in his prime, coat clean, muscles loose beneath the harness. He watched reflections in storefront glass, ears rotating, cataloging sound and scent the way he had been trained to do. Ethan watched people. He noticed how faces changed when a patrol car rolled by, how smiles thinned and shoulders squared. He noticed how Linda's diner was quieter than it should have been for a weekday, and how the same 2 officers' car seems to idle nearby longer than necessary. The incident happened outside a feed store. A man with out-of-state plates had pulled into the gravel lot, dust still clinging to his bumper. He looked to be in his mid-40s, average height, a little soft around the middle, wearing a windbreaker that had seen better days. His hair was dark and thin his hands careful as he counted bills at the register inside. Ethan saw him exit with a paper sack and a hopeful expression that faded when the patrol car eased in behind him. Officer Caleb Norton stepped out first, sunlight flashing on his badge. He didn't hurry. He never did. His posture suggested he had all the time in the world. Officer Ryan Cole followed, lingering near the cruiser, eyes scanning the street. The man froze, confusion crossing his face. Caleb spoke calmly, gesturing toward the road. Ethan couldn't hear the words from where he stood, but he recognized the cadence, the measured tone designed to sound reasonable while offering no real choice. The man protested, just a little. He shook his head, pointed at his receipt, his mouth forming explanations. Caleb listened, then tilted his head and smiled. A minute later, the man's shoulders slumped. He reached into his wallet and pulled out cash with fingers that trembled. Caleb took it, counted quickly, and waved him off with a friendly pat on the car door. The patrol car pulled away. The man stood there for a moment, staring after it, then got into his vehicle and left without looking back. Ethan felt the decision settle in his chest, heavy and certain. This wasn't about temper or pride. It wasn't even about him. It was about truth, quietly preserved before it could be erased. Back at the farmhouse, he opened the lockbox bolted beneath the sink. Inside lay the small camera, no bigger than a matchbox, matte black and unassuming. He held it for a moment, weighing the choice. He had promised himself a life without missions. But watching wasn't the same as intervening. Watching meant patience. Watching meant letting the truth speak when people could not. Axel stood calmly as Ethan adjusted the harness, fingers moving with practiced care. The dog accepted the added weight without concern, amber eyes steady. Ethan clipped the camera into place and tested the angle, then tapped the side twice. Axel's ears lifted. Work mode. Not pursuit, observation. Over the next 2 days, they walked Red Creek. They sat in parked trucks and stood beneath awnings when the sun turned sharp. Ethan did not approach. He did not confront. He let the town reveal itself. The camera caught Caleb leaning into car windows, the same slow smile, the same gestures. It caught Ryan collecting envelopes from a hardware store owner with a pinched expression and downcast eyes. It caught a gas station clerk handing over cash while pretending not to see the patrol car's lights. Ethan reviewed the footage at night, sitting at the kitchen table while cicadas sang outside. He cataloged dates, times, faces. He didn't edit. He didn't embellish. He let the images stand as they were. Axel lay at his feet, tail occasionally thumping when Ethan's hand drifted down to scratch behind his ears. On the third afternoon, the pattern sharpened. Caleb didn't just roam. He met people. Behind the municipal building, near a chain-link fence overgrown with weeds, a black SUV pulled in. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, silver hair cut close, wearing a tailored jacket that didn't belong to Red Creek. His face was clean-shaven, his movements precise. He carried himself like someone used to being listened to. They spoke briefly. No cash changed hands. Instead, the man handed Caleb a slim folder. Caleb nodded, respectful in a way Ethan hadn't seen him be with anyone else. Later, Ethan paused the footage and zoomed in on the man's face. The resemblance was unmistakable. Same jawline, same eyes, different polish. The realization came without drama and stayed without mercy. This wasn't a bully running loose. This was a system. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the farmhouse quiet around him. He thought of Linda's son in the hallway, of Harold's warning, of the man at the feed store counting his loss in silence. He had come to Red Creek to learn how to live slowly. Instead, he had learned something else. Justice didn't rush. It waited until someone chose to see. Sunday morning arrived with the sound of church bells drifting faintly across Red Creek, their slow rhythm folding into the hum of pickup engines and the quiet conversations of neighbors heading out for breakfast. By the time Ethan Walker and Axel reached the diner, every parking space was filled. Inside, the room buzzed with familiar voices, the clink of plates, the comforting chaos of a place that served as more than a restaurant. It was where people came to feel normal. Ethan paused just inside the door. He scanned the room, not for exits this time, but for patterns. His eyes settled on it immediately. The booth near the front window, sunlit and conspicuously empty. The cushions were uncreased, the table untouched, as if it existed behind invisible tape. He felt Axel's leash slacken in his hand as the dog sensed the change in Ethan's focus. Linda Harris noticed him too. She stood behind the counter, her brown hair pinned neatly back for the Sunday rush, cheeks flushed from the heat of the grill. Her hazel eyes met his, and for a brief second something unspoken passed between them. A warning, a question. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, glancing toward the empty booth. Ethan gave her a small nod. Nothing dramatic, just acknowledgement. He walked to the booth and sat down. There was no flourish to it, no announcement. He simply slid into the seat, set his napkin on his lap, and rested his hands on the table. Axel folded beneath the booth, settling at Ethan's feet, his black and tan coat blending into shadow. He lay with his head up this time, eyes open, calm but attentive. A hush rippled outward, subtle but undeniable. Conversations didn't stop, but they thinned. A woman halfway through a sentence lowered her voice. A man stirring sugar into his coffee slowed, spoon clinking softly against porcelain. Ethan felt the weight of attention without anyone daring to look directly at him. Linda approached, notepad in hand. Up close, the strain in her expression was clearer than ever. She was 35, but motherhood and constant caution had carved years into her posture. Still, she stood straight. "Morning," she said, voice steady. "What can I get you?" "Same as before," Ethan replied quietly. "Eggs, toast." "Coffee. Nothing special." Linda wrote it down, hands steady, though her eyes flicked once more toward the booth before she turned away. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then the door opened. Officer Caleb Norton entered first, his presence immediately drawing the room's attention like a magnet. He wore his uniform crisp and clean, blonde hair neatly trimmed, face relaxed into that familiar half-smile. Behind him followed Officer Ryan Cole, thinner, quieter, his dark hair combed carefully into place. They stopped just inside, surveying the diner. Caleb's gaze found the empty booth, and froze. The smile didn't vanish, but it hardened. He stepped forward slowly, boots heavy on the tile. Ryan lingered a pace behind, eyes darting briefly to the counter, then back to Caleb. "Well," Caleb said lightly, loud enough for several tables to hear. "Looks like someone found our seat." Ethan didn't look up. He reached for his coffee as Linda set it down, nodding politely. "Morning," he said to her. "Thank you." Linda's fingers brushed the counter as she withdrew, and for a moment her hand lingered there, knuckles pale. Caleb approached the booth, stopping just short of the table. He looked down at Ethan, then let his gaze drop deliberately beneath the booth. His boot shifted slightly, toe nudging status, not enough to be obvious, but enough to invade the space Axel occupied. Axel stiffened. The movement was instinctive, a ripple through muscle and bone. A low sound rose from his chest, not a bark, not a snarl, but a warning, controlled and deliberate. The sound cut through the diner like a blade. Several people flinched. A fork clattered to the floor. Ethan's hand moved once, firm and calm, fingers tightening on the leash. "Stay," he said quietly. Axel obeyed. The growl faded, replaced by tense silence. His amber eyes never left Caleb's boot. Caleb raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "That dog's aggressive," he said mildly. "Might not be safe in a public place." Ethan finally looked up. His eyes were steady, unreadable. "He reacted to being threatened," he replied, "like anyone would." Caleb laughed softly. "You suggesting my foot's a threat?" "I'm suggesting you move it," Ethan said. For a moment it seemed Caleb might push further. Instead, he straightened, glancing around the room. His eyes lingered on the faces turned carefully away, on the hands gripping coffee mugs too tightly. "Everyone okay here?" he asked, voice carrying. No one answered, except one man. He stood up slowly from a booth near the back. He was in his early 70s, tall but stooped, with thinning gray hair and a face lined by years of sun and restraint. His name was Walter Reed, a retired school janitor who had lived in Red Creek his entire life. He had always been quiet, always careful, but now his hands trembled as they rested on the edge of the table. "That's enough," Walter said, voice thin but clear. "The man's just eating breakfast." The room seemed to inhale sharply. Caleb turned, smile gone now. "Sit down, Walter," he said. "This doesn't concern you." Walter shook his head. "It concerns all of us." Ryan moved first. He stepped forward quickly, one hand outstretched. "Sir, please." His hand struck Walter's shoulder, not hard, but enough. Walter lost his balance and fell, chair scraping loudly as it tipped. Gasps erupted. Linda cried out and rushed from behind the status. Ethan was on his feet instantly, Axel rising with him, body taut. But he did not advance. He stood there, silent, watching as Linda knelt beside Walter, helping him sit up. Something had shifted. The fear in the room was still there, but it was no longer whole. The diner felt smaller after Walter Reed was helped back into his seat, as if the walls themselves had leaned inward to listen. Ethan stood motionless beside the table, one hand resting lightly on Axel's harness, the other open and visible. He did not raise his voice. He did not step forward. He simply watched the officers long enough for them to understand that whatever came next would not be loud, but it would be decisive. Officer Caleb Norton recovered first. His face tightened, the easy confidence draining into something sharper. He adjusted his belt and took a step closer, chest out, voice controlled. "All right," he said, glancing around the room. "That's enough excitement for one morning." He turned to Ethan. "You're coming with us." Ethan met his gaze. Up close, Caleb was younger than his authority suggested, early 30s, clean-shaven, pale blue eyes that avoided holding contact too long. He wasn't cruel by nature, Ethan sensed. He was obedient. That made him dangerous in a different way. "On what charge?" Ethan asked calmly. Caleb's jaw worked. "Disturbing the peace." A pause. "And failure to control a dangerous animal." Axel stood now, muscles taut beneath his coat, but silent. Ethan felt the leash vibrate with restrained energy. "Sit," he murmured. Axel obeyed instantly, lowering himself without breaking eye contact with the officers. The display unsettled several patrons. Control like that wasn't normal. It was trained. Officer Ryan Cole moved behind Ethan, reaching for his cuffs. Ryan was taller, broader through the shoulders, with dark stubble and eyes that flicked nervously toward the door. He'd grown up in Red Creek, Ethan guessed, the kind of man shaped by a town that taught silence as survival. Ryan snapped the cuffs on tighter than necessary, metal biting into Ethan's wrists. Ethan did not resist. That was the moment the room exhaled, believing the danger had passed. Linda Harris pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes following Ethan as he was guided toward the door. She looked smaller now, wrapped in guilt she had no words for. Ethan caught her gaze and gave a subtle shake of his head. "Not your fault." Axel strained as Ethan was led away, a low whine rising from his chest. "Stay," Ethan said again, softly but firmly. The dog froze, confusion flickering across his intelligent face, but obedience won. 2 uniformed animal control officers appeared at the doorway, leashes in hand, and gently coaxed Axel away. His head twisted back once, eyes searching for Ethan, before the door closed between them. The patrol car ride was short and silent. Sunlight flashed through the windows as they passed familiar streets, but Ethan saw none of it. He counted turns, noted time. He had done this before, not as a prisoner, but as a planner. The holding room was small, windowless, painted a dull institutional gray. A single metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs. The camera in the corner blinked red. Caleb gestured for Ethan to sit. "We'll sort this out," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The door shut. Minutes passed. Then footsteps. The door opened again, and this time Sheriff Mark Holloway entered. He was a thick-set man in his late 50s, with graying hair and a heavy mustache that drooped over a mouth accustomed to frowns. His uniform was immaculate, his posture rigid. He had been sheriff of Red Creek for nearly 2 decades. Power had settled into his bones. "Remove the cuffs," Holloway said. Ryan hesitated. Holloway's eyes snapped toward him. "Now!" The cuffs came off. Holloway waited until the door closed again. Then he reached up and flipped the breaker beside the camera. The red light died. Holloway leaned back against the table, arms crossed. "You caused quite a scene," he said. "People got ideas." "I stopped a man from being hurt," Ethan replied evenly. Holloway's lips twitched. You embarrassed my department. He leaned forward. This town doesn't need outsiders stirring things up, especially armed ones. I wasn't armed, Ethan said. Holloway smiled thinly. Your dog is. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Ethan felt the familiar pull of anger. Old, controlled, locked away for years. He kept his voice level. You kicked him. No, Holloway said. My deputy did. Silence stretched. Holloway straightened. Here's how this ends. You leave Red Creek today. Charges disappear. Your dog comes back unharmed. You get your quiet farm life. He stepped closer. Or we make this very unpleasant. Ethan studied the man. The lined face, the practiced certainty. This wasn't arrogance. This was habit. He nodded slowly. All right. Holloway blinked. All right? I'll go, Ethan said, if you release my dog. Holloway searched his face for deception and found none, or so he thought. Smart choice. As Holloway turned to the door, Ethan spoke again softly. Before you do anything else, you should know something. Holloway paused, hand on the handle. The camera on my dog, Ethan said, lifting his eyes, was never turned off. The room went still. Holloway turned back slowly. What did you say? Ethan's voice remained calm, almost gentle. Axel wears a live feed body camera. Encrypted. Everything since the diner, audio included, has been transmitting to an off-site server. He held Holloway's gaze, including this conversation. The sheriff's face drained of color. That's not possible. It is, Ethan said. And if I don't check in within the hour, the files are forwarded automatically. Holloway's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced instinctively at the dead camera, as if it might come back to life through sheer will. For the first time, uncertainty cracked his authority. Ethan leaned back in his chair, unrestrained now, and waited. Morning came to Red Creek quietly, as if the town itself were afraid to speak too soon. A thin layer of fog clung to the streets, softening the outlines of storefronts and stop signs, muffling sound the way a held breath muffles a sigh. For the first time in years, the silence did not feel like fear. It felt like waiting. Ethan Walker stood outside the sheriff's station with his hands free, the cuffs removed not with apology, but with haste. Axel sat at his side, close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth of his shoulder through his jeans. The German shepherd looked unchanged, 8 years old, broad-chested, sable coat brushed to a dull shine. But his eyes were different now. They were alert, yes, but calmer, as if the tension he had carried for days had finally loosened its grip. The sound came before the sight. Engines, heavier, deeper than local patrol cars. State police cruisers rolled in first, lights flashing but sirens silent. Then unmarked federal vehicles followed, dark and anonymous. Men and women stepped out with the posture of professionals who did not need to raise their voices to be obeyed. One woman stood out immediately. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Collins moved with a controlled purpose that drew attention without demanding it. She was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with dark auburn hair pulled into a low, practical knot. Her skin was pale, almost translucent in the morning light, and her gray eyes missed nothing. There was no jewelry, no softness in her suit, but her expression was not cruel. It was precise. People like her did not enjoy dismantling lives, but they did not hesitate either. Years ago, her brother had lost his job after reporting corruption in another small town. That history lived quietly behind her eyes. Inside the station, the truth unfolded without drama. Screens were set up in the briefing room. Officers stood along the walls, some stiff with fear, others with a dawning, almost painful relief. The footage played in order. a tourist being pressured for cash, a whispered exchange behind a hardware store, a deputy's boot nudging too close to a dog under a diner table, voices that had assumed no one was listening. Sheriff Mark Holloway sat pale and rigid as the recordings continued. When the final clip ended, his own voice, confident and threatening in what he had believed was a private room, no one spoke. Sarah Collins closed her folder. "This is sufficient," she said calmly. "Arrests will proceed." There was no shouting, no resistance, just the quiet sound of careers ending. Word traveled faster than sirens ever could. By mid-morning, Red Creek gathered in clusters, outside the diner, near the post office, in the parking lot of the feed store. People stood closer together than usual. Some cried openly. Others simply watched, hands folded, absorbing the unfamiliar sight of authority being questioned instead of feared. At the diner, Linda Harris unlocked the door with hands that trembled, not from fear this time, but from release. She wore the same uniform she always did, but her shoulders were lighter, her breathing deeper. Her young son, Noah, sat at a corner booth with a coloring book, his sandy hair falling into his eyes as he worked carefully within the lines. Linda glanced at him often, as if reassuring herself he was real, that this piece could be touched. Customers arrived early. They lingered. Laughter returned in cautious bursts, then fuller ones. Plates clinked. Coffee steamed. The empty booth by the window was no longer avoided. A retired couple took it first, hands entwined, sunlight warming their backs. Ethan did not sit inside. He stood across the street, hands in his pockets, watching through the glass as life resumed. Axel leaned against his leg, tail swaying slowly. There was no pride in Ethan's expression, no hunger for recognition, only a tired contentment, the kind that came from knowing when to step away. Linda spotted him and hurried out, wiping her hands on her apron. Up close, her face showed the marks of years spent swallowing words. But now her eyes were bright. She stopped a few feet from him, unsure. Then she reached forward and hugged him. Brief, fierce, grateful. "I still have my job," she said, voice thick. "And my insurance." "And my town." Ethan nodded. "You did the hard part," he replied. "You stayed." A few others gathered, Walter Reed among them, standing straighter than he had in years. He did not salute this time. He simply extended his hand. Ethan took it. By early afternoon, Ethan was gone. His truck rolled past the welcome sign at the edge of Red Creek without ceremony. No parade, no speeches. Axel sat in the passenger seat, head out the open window, ears catching the wind. Ethan kept his eyes on the road ahead, the farm waiting, the quiet he had come here to find finally within reach. Behind them, Red Creek breathed, not because a hero had stayed, but because the truth had. Sometimes the miracle is not thunder from the sky or angels appearing in light. Sometimes God's miracle looks like truth arriving quietly, exactly when fear has ruled for too long. In Red Creek, no one was saved by violence or power, but by patience, courage, and a willingness to stand still when it would have been easier to walk away. Scripture reminds us, "The truth shall set you free." And when truth is spoken, darkness cannot remain. In our daily lives, we may feel small, unheard, or afraid to speak. But God sees every act of quiet righteousness. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe for more stories of faith and courage, and may God bless you, protect your loved ones, and remind you every day that justice, guided by His hand, is never lost.